Our topic this evening is Plato and Christianity. So we'll talk a little bit about just the evolution of the discipline of philosophy. So this is a kind of a timeline and hierarchy of science, of the branches of science, and also, let's say, the scale of the universe and what each one of the sciences is studying. So this is essentially, the idea here is philosophy ultimately is the mother of all disciplines. If we get all the way back down to the lower right-hand corner here of formal science, we have mathematics and logic. Logic as reasoning and philosophy. So in other words, these basic bedrock that all of the other things that are built upon as we're having specializations now in social sciences, life sciences, physical sciences, and so forth. When we go back to the time period of the ancient Greeks, when we're in the time period of Plato and Aristotle and so on, more or less the study of all of these things fell within the purview of what they would call philosophy. There's some components of it that didn't fit into that. And then if you were studying the more natural world part of it, then that would be essentially a natural philosopher is what you'd say. But essentially it would still fall within that discipline. So over time, what's happened is that as ancient philosophy has essentially thrown off all of these other fields, everything from natural philosophy then becomes the physical sciences, chemistry, and so forth, mathematics, everything becomes separated. And so nowadays, if you are going to go to graduate school and get a philosophy degree, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's necessary to learn quantum physics or to learn biology or anything like that. In fact, those aren't essential to what philosophy still does today. And so whereas in ancient time periods, the word philosopher and so forth was essentially all encompassing of any kind of study that you might do, now because we know so much and because everything is so very specialized, all of these different things are fields, and there's now a very specialized field of philosophy today. We've talked about this before, so we've had a lecture just a month ago on religion, and we talked about how ancient religion, like ancient philosophy being all-encompassing of all knowledge and study, ancient religion was all-encompassing of everything you might do in life. So it covered everything from, of course, still your relationships with the divine, your sense of propriety, law was backed up by it, prayer, things that are still considered to be religious, divination maybe, but the calendar, writing itself is religious. All sports, that was religion. These are all religious festivals. Just processing of meat, that simply essentially wasn't done outside of temples in the ancient world. Comedy, drama, entertainment, that was part of, again, religious festivals, as were parades, holidays, travel and tourism. In other words, that was going on pilgrimages and so forth. Care for the sick, care for the poor. This is all components of religion in the ancient world. And so, like we saw with philosophy, where ancient religion was all-encompassing, many of these features, like the Super Bowl or something like that, sports, those, some of the people watch sports very religiously, but it isn't generally categorized what we think of today as religion. So the border that has been drawn around formal religion or organized religion encloses less and less as all of these other kinds of activities have been spun off over time in our culture and history. So we talked about this in the religion lecture. So the idea of religion lacks meaning. And so we spent an entire lecture talking about how our definition or even our use of this word at all is an idea that's born from an early modern European context that really doesn't actually translate to antiquity or to the rest of the world and doesn't really have any meaning. And so the Western Judeo-Christian ideas about the meaning of the religion are based on specific European history, and they don't really translate outside that Judeo-Christian context. Religion in places outside the West encompasses many facets of society that aren't considered religion in the West at this point. So we also have seen that it's almost impossible even to define the word. And so I looked up Wikipedia, what is religion, and the religion article. And so it defines it as, or currently, it could be edited at any time. Religion is a cultural system of designated behaviors and practices, morals, worldviews, texts, sanctified places, prophecies, ethics, or, so this is not and, any one of these things, these don't have to be included, or organizations that relates humanity to the supernatural, the transcendental, or spiritual elements. However, there is no scholarly consensus over what precisely constitutes a religion. So we've talked about how complicated this is and how no one thing is, does the word have any particular one meaning. Nevertheless, there's a sense especially coming out of the 19th and 20th century West, that science and religion are hostile and that they are antagonistic, and indeed many people who consider themselves very, very religious are hostile to what they think of or understand to be science, and many scientists today are hostile to that kind of religion, or maybe even all of religion, because they identify that kind of fundamentalism with religion in general. So, for example, one of our favorite guys, and I guess I talk about him because of that giant Noah's Ark that they built in Kentucky as well, but he also has this creationist museum where this guy, Ken Ham, insists that human beings coexisted among dinosaurs because he believes all kinds of crazy things, but essentially that the Earth was only a few thousand years old and so on. And so he's made a bunch of exhibits to show humans running around with dinosaurs and so on. And so the logical evolution of this sort of fundamentalist Christianist idea, I wouldn't call it Christianity, but like Christianism in the same way, instead of Muslims, we would say Islamists. So Christianists, have essentially, here he is, Saint Reagan with a gun on riding a dinosaur to save the universe and that sort of thing, the Messiah. All right. So that's just silly, but I didn't make that picture. That's on the internet. So anyway, anti-intellectualism is not new. But I think the perceived general antagonism between science and religion is a modern phenomenon entirely. In the Middle Ages, for example, there was a complete overlap between science and religion. In the medieval West, there was scholars and philosophers, including natural philosophers, which is the medieval and ancient word for what we would now call a scientist. A scientist is a modern word. They were all clerics. Everybody who was trained essentially in any of the universities, which are all church schools, are essentially clerics or members of the clergy. Latin, of course, today is still the language, of scientific language, and it's still the language of the church in the West, the Catholic Church. And there's no, it's not a coincidence. It's because the church is what kept science alive and what science is all derived from, again, medieval and ancient clerics. The university system, everything like that, those are all founded as church schools. So we use as our kind of our symbol or our background or backdrop for this group, the History, Theology, Philosophy group, this picture by Raphael, which is the school of Athens. And I've seen we went and visited this. But what we sometimes don't think about is that this is actually a painting that the Pope Julius II commissioned Raphael to make, and this is in the papal chambers in the Vatican. So this is not something where all of these philosophers or anything like that are viewed as antagonists or enemies, but rather they're quite being honored at, the heart of Western Christendom at the time, in the Vatican. Same thing when we look at this, the painting in general, the setting, you can see that this place of ancient philosophy, Athens, of course, never looked this grand, certainly not in Plato's time, but as reimagined as this philosophical utopia, in fact, architecturally, what's being portrayed here is the new St. Peter's that Julius II has commissioned and is being rebuilt. So he had demolished the old 4th century basilica, and now they're building new St. Peter's, the St. Peter's that we all know today. And you can kind of see here then an idea that all of ancient philosophy and the philosophers, natural science, and so forth are wholly consonant with the contemporary church, at least when Raphael is painting this. Okay, and so because science descends from ancient philosophy, ancient philosophers are often viewed through the lenses of modern scientists. And so we tend to look back and we figure, well, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle are effectively like modern scientists, and if we think of the stereotype of many modern scientists anyway, therefore kind of, let's say, at least not interested in religion or being religious. So some, of course, are religious, but many are, let's say, at least agnostic, and some are very actively atheists, and so on. But because of the all-encompassing nature in antiquity, ancient philosophers should also be viewed through the lens of religious reformer. So what I would also suggest is that the things that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were doing was kind of similar to what Martin Luther is doing in terms of proposing that the traditional religion that they had inherited was in need of reformation. And they were not talking about eliminating everything, but rather reforming it and getting to a sense of, let's say, what truly matters. Another thing that is true in antiquity is that there was also an overlap in church and state. And we've talked about this before when we've looked at the history of paganism. So there was no separation of church and state. These are two different statues of the Emperor Augustus. In the one, he's wearing the toga of a civic magistrate, and the other one, he's wearing his toga as a priest, a civic priest. So all you do is you put the thing up, and suddenly now the same guy is the priest. And we talked about how, for example, Julius Caesar, one of his early titles and positions was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, same title, one of the Pope's many titles, the Pontifex Maximus. Okay, so let's look a little bit now, as we're talking about that context, let's look a little bit about Plato and Plato's influence. So as the student of Socrates, who himself left no written works, and as the teacher of Aristotle, Plato was arguably the most influential thinker in the Western tradition. So Alfred North Whitehead kind of famously characterized all of the Western philosophical tradition as a series of footnotes to Plato. And of course, whenever anybody makes a sweeping statement like that everybody argues against it and say, well, that's overreach and so on. Yet, nevertheless, you can kind of see, when we look at it, we can see that he has a point, and that he even can make such a point. It's important to say Plato's an important thinker of the Western tradition. Plato also, like I would say, is a religious reformer. So traditional Greek religion at the time was about piety, ritual behavior performed to propitiate the gods who were viewed as totally unpredictable, chaotic forces, by asking questions like, how do you live a good life? What is justice? Philosophers attempted to add rational ethics to pagan life. So Plato developed a very highly spiritualized metaphysics. And so in contrast to the very fleshy, all too human, physical gods of Homer, Plato formulated a highly spiritualized metaphysics. He promoted a very strong spirit-body dualism, and argued that the transitory material world, the physical world, was a mere shadow or illusion in contrast to the eternal world of the ideas or the forms, which he said were atemporal, aspatial, and immaterial. So this is was a huge gauntlet that he threw down, and like I said, then everybody, as they've either built on that or argued against that, that's those series of footnotes that we're talking about in terms of Western thought. We talked about one of the formulation of that kind of Plato's philosophical thought, what's either called Platonic realism or Platonic idealism, from his sense that ideas are actually more real than the material world, is his famous allegory of the cave. And most of you who watch the lectures are not also going to our church service, but on Sunday, to begin our church service, I actually recounted the parable of the cave because of how relevant this is to the idea of Christianity and so on. But anyway, let's just talk about it very briefly. So the idea in this parable is, imagine a series of prisoners who are chained in a cave. They're watching a shadow play on a wall, and that's the only direction they can see. As far as they could assume that everything that is going on, that's reality, because that's all their senses are showing them. However, if they could be unchained, if they could get up, if they could turn around, they would see, wait a second, this shadow play is not, the shadows here are only shadows that are being cast by something else, that something else being puppets that are lit by a dim firelight. So it's not even anything real, it's a shadow of something unreal. And then further, if those prisoners were to escape and make their way out of the cave and emerge into our real world and see the light and see true light and the sun, it would be almost inconceivable to them when they experience the ideal world, the world of real reality, according to Plato. Anyway, so this is essentially an allegory that's explaining, again, Plato's very strong idealism, that we shouldn't be captivated by all of the things our senses are telling us, all of the sort of traditional material realities that we get caught up in our day-to-day lives, and instead be concentrating on things that are more real, which is to say eternal concepts like essentially justice and goodness and so forth. So for Plato, the ultimate superlative idea is the form of the good. So he explains this in analogy with the sun. So, for example, that prisoner going up and seeing the sun. The sun is not sight, but it is the cause of sight itself. The sun is in the visible realm as the form of the good is in the intelligible realm. It, quote, gives truth to things that are known and the power to know the knower. The good is not only the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also the object of knowledge. So it's a complicated way of kind of saying this. The idea is, okay, sun is not only sight; it's the cause of sight itself. So in other words, you might have eyes and the ability to see, but without light, you can't actually exercise that. And so, likewise, this by analogy, this highest form, this highest idea, goodness for goodness' own sake, the good. Is both the cause of knowledge and truth, and is also the object of that knowledge for Plato. Okay. Another thing that is also very true is, as again, Plato as a religious reformer, he in his book The Republic, where he's talking about how to have a perfect utopia or society, because the behavior of the gods in the traditional poems of Homer and Hesiod did not conform to the ethics of reforming philosophers like himself, Plato argued that ancient Greek religious texts should be banned so as to eliminate divine precedents for immoral activity. This is a complaint that people sometimes make when they read Greek mythology. They think, how can people have a religion where their gods are behaving so horribly and it's frankly comedically, where the gods are often so dumb and get caught up in all of this kind of thing. Well, ancient philosophers also made that kind of argument and said, well, this gives people an excuse for their bad behavior. Person can be a philanderer, and they say, well, Zeus does the same, and so on. Anyway, so this is an example, I think, of Plato attempting here to be a religious reformer. Okay, so that's some Plato context. What does Plato have to do with Jesus, since the concept of this lecture here is Plato and Christianity? So even if people, might see, okay, I can see what you're saying. Plato was a sort of a religious reformer because he is promoting ethical behavior and a very spiritual, kind of metaphysical worldview. What does that have to do with Jesus? So Plato lived in Athens some 4 centuries prior to Jesus, and Jesus was a Galilean Jew who practiced a kind of Judaism of the Second Temple period. We talked about that in our lecture recently on the historical Jesus. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And that's a question posed by early Christians themselves. In fact, Tertullian, an important early Christian thinker, and actually the first major Christian writer in Latin, he considered Plato and Aristotle to be forefathers of heresy. And in an argument that Greco-Roman classics should not be the basis of Christian education, he asks this famous question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What does the academy have to do with the church? The academy being the name of Plato's philosophical school. What does that have to do with the church? Of course, in antiquity, in the Roman Empire here that Tertullian is living in, studying classical texts is how you got an education. So you would be reading all of those Greco-Roman classics. Tertullian was sort of saying, no, we should just be focusing on scripture and so on and so forth, and have an entirely new curriculum. By the way, an idea or a thing that didn't actually happen. In fact, actually, throughout all of Western history, Christian history, churches and church schools, the universities and so on, kept on studying classics. So Tertullian, anyway, was talking about it, but it didn't actually go through. And by the way, Tertullian himself was classically educated. All of his terms and concepts are inherited from classical philosophy. His own theological arguments, when he would make them, it actually depended on Stoicism. So he, was sort of rejecting the philosophers sort of overtly or explicitly, but implicitly, he'd already adopted that worldview, that language, and he used that to even understand Christianity himself. So, for example, he was the first Christian to formulate God as tres personae una substantia, in other words, 3 persons but 1 substance. And substance here is a technical philosophical term, a Latin term for a Greek term in philosophy that's still not very well understood by lay people, right? And so, we talk about, this is a formulation of the Trinity, right? So the Trinity is 1 substance for God, but in 3 persons. Substance here is the same word that when Catholics are talking about the Eucharist being transubstantiated, so in other words, being literally the body and blood of Christ in the mystery of the sacrament, they're actually not saying that it has been transmaterialized, because this is not a material argument. So it's not like a transporter in Star Trek has changed the molecular composition of the emblems of the host and so forth. Rather, the substance has changed, which is philosophically akin to saying the purpose. So now that that object has become one in purpose, according to Catholic theology, with God, and so it effectively then is, as opposed to materially is. Anyway, so I just mentioned that because it's very confused. People have argued, well, Catholics think the Protestants have said Catholics are saying they're actually eating, anyway, don't need to go into the complexity, but it's confusing. What I'm saying is that there is the basis for all of these things ends up being the inherited philosophical language that Tertullian and all of his successors had. So what did Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Turns out Tertullian, it's an awful lot, and even for Tertullian, it was continued to have a lot to do with each other. There had already been, so way before Jesus was even born, lots of Greek influence in Second Temple Judaism. So the conquest of the Persian Empire by Aristotle's student Alexander of Macedon meant that as of 332 BC, Judea became a province ruled by Hellenistic or Greek-speaking kings. And so although many Judeans resisted the introduction of Greek ideas and customs, many of them enthusiastically adopted them. So, for example, elite Judeans took Greek names. So the high priests in Jerusalem took names such as Jason and Menelaus. Even the Maccabees, these Hasmonean kings who very famously, if you know the Hanukkah story and so forth, led an anti-Hellenistic Judean revolt against the Hellenistic kings in order to have a kind of the short-lived Judean kingdom. They took names like Antigonus and Alexander. These are not Bible names. These are Homer names. In other words, these are Greek names. And in fact, for the earliest synagogues, the decoration. So this is a floor, and you can just see the decoration of this is. And it seems so amazing in one of our earliest ancient Jewish synagogues. It's the zodiac signs, which in a lot of cases are themselves, Greek gods, the constellations, and the center is Helios, the sun. And so anyway, there is a lot of Hellenism going on. Certainly the fact that there was a giant Jewish community in Alexandria. Alexandria was the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt. It was the capital of Greek thought. So initially in Plato and Aristotle's time and so on, it had been Athens. Now in the Hellenistic era, Alexandria is the place where everything moves. It's where the museum is, which is to say the temple in honor of the Muses, and that's where the great library was housed. It also had a massive Jewish diaspora community, many more Jewish, a much bigger community than what anywhere is existing in Judea itself. So the city has 500,000 people, and so this Jewish community read their scriptures and worshiped in Greek there. So they're interacting with Greek speakers at the heart of essentially the intellectual capital, the cultural capital of the Hellenistic world. They translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the Septuagint. It's traditionally composed by the 70 Jewish scholars in Alexandria at the behest of Ptolemy. That's a legendary story, not a historical story, but in any event, the grouping became the earliest compilation of books that became the Hebrew Bible brought the Hebrew Bible into a canonical collection as opposed to just individual books. The Septuagint also then was used exclusively by the Christian writers of the New Testament, who did not go back to the Hebrew Bible for their, the Hebrew language version of it to make their quotations. They were just quoting every time Jesus quotes from the Hebrew Bible in the Greek New Testament. He's just quoting from the Septuagint. Okay. So there is also, in addition to Greek philosophy, there is a biblical tradition of wisdom. So the book of Proverbs includes the character of holy wisdom, and she describes her part in the creation. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When he established the heavens, I was there. While the earliest components of Proverbs are part of the pre-Hellenistic Middle Eastern wisdom tradition, and they include a translation of a very popular ancient Egyptian compilation book of wisdom, later books of the Septuagint, such as Ecclesiastes, which was composed in the 3rd century BC, and Sirach in the 2nd century BC, they continued to be written in the Hellenistic era and are updated then to include Greek thought, which is now the contemporary thought. We've had a whole lecture on Philo of Alexandria, who's essentially a contemporary of Jesus, and he's among the leaders of that Jewish diaspora community in Alexandria. He's trained in Greek philosophy, and he attempts to build on the biblical wisdom tradition and to reinterpret the Hebrew Bible using the philosophical tools developed by Plato's heirs. And he himself then makes Moses into a proto-philosopher, essentially someone who God revealed all of Plato's ideas to before and who wrote them all down and so on before, centuries before Plato existed. All right. So, for example, building on that connection in Proverbs of the holy wisdom, connecting holy wisdom with the Spirit of God and the spoken words of creation in Genesis, Philo elaborated a cosmology identifying this figure, holy wisdom, the spoken word, with God's logos, God's word. So this is an all-important word in Greek philosophy. The logos for Philo became God's firstborn son and the mediator between the created world and the unseen, unknowable creator. So the author of the Gospel of John, as we've seen, may have been very familiar with Philo, and he retells the creation story using that same term. Quoted this before. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was in the beginning with God. Things came into being through him, the Logos, and without him not one thing came into being. However, by identifying the Logos with Christ, the gospel goes beyond Philo, who remained a Jewish leader. The Logos became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. No one has ever seen God, the unknowable, unseeable Creator. It is God, only the Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. So now we can see the Logos, God's glory, because we understand that and we can envision that through the Christian idea of Christ, the second person of the Trinity. All right, so that's the Christian formulation. If we back up a little bit to the historical Jesus, Jesus was from Nazareth, a Jewish village in Galilee next to the Hellenistic city of Sepphoris. So there's a minority of scholars of the historical Jesus. My favorite minority, though, scholars like John Dominic Crossan, his book I really recommend and really love, they've argued that many of Jesus' teachings and tactics are reminiscent of the Cynics, which is an ancient Greek philosophical school that is devoted to upending social conventions. One of my favorite biblical scholars, Randall McCraw-Helms, argues that the Jesus that we find in the Q source, the sayings gospel, the hypothetical source of the sayings that are now found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, that Jesus, or that author there of Q, was familiar with the prudential wisdom of the Jesus in the book of Sirach. So the book of Sirach is also written by, Jesus is a common name back then, so it was also written by someone named Jesus. And in fact, that the Jesus in the New Testament, Jesus Christ here, is making his sayings in direct opposition. So in the book of Sirach, we read, "The Most High hates sinners. Never help a sinner. Never trust your enemy. Do not have him at your side, or he will trip you up." So this is a prudential type of wisdom, and it is completely argued against by the wisdom sayings that are attributed to Jesus from the Q sayings gospel that are now in Luke and Matthew. So Jesus here says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who treat you spitefully. So, there's a certain sense, let's say, of practical wisdom. You don't trust your enemies. Don't have them at your side. They're going to go after you. I mean, that's a kind of like a common sense wisdom, but it doesn't necessarily lead to making the world, let's say, a better place. As what the argument here that turns it over anyway in the Jesus of the Gospels. Here's another example. So Jesus, the son of Sirach, in the book of Sirach, lists a number of people and activities that are blessed. Blessed are the so-and-so. Woe unto so-and-so. And Jesus takes exactly the opposite position. So in Sirach we read, "You who fear the Lord expect prosperity, lasting happiness, and favor. Blessed is the rich that is found without blemish. Wealth is good." Greed is good, I guess. That's a great 1980s repetition of ancient Sirach, right? So Jesus turns that around, obviously, in the Gospels. So, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Woe to you who are rich, for you've received your consolation. So the opposite wisdom tradition, but part of a wisdom dialogue, perhaps. Sirach here again says, a devout man lends to his neighbors, but if he cannot repay the neighbor, he has defrauded the other of his money and gratuitously made an enemy of him. He will pay him back in curses and insults. So again, practical wisdom. If you have to give loans to people or whatever, but if they don't pay you back, curse them. And Jesus in the Gospel says, if you lend only where you expect to be repaid, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to each other to be repaid in full. So thus here, if Jesus is responding to Sirach, what he's essentially saying is what Sirach is calling a devout man, for Jesus is only a sinner, right? That's only what... anyway. Okay. All right. So after Jesus' death, Christians needed sophisticated theological tools to try to understand Jesus' relationship with God in the context of monotheism. So they were agreed they were monotheists. There's only one God, essentially. They're not all agreed, but anyway, pretty much everybody was agreed. Even the pagans, the philosophers, more or less agreed that there is essentially one divine source, even if there might be, let's say, multiple gods, Apollo and Zeus and so on, who are all emanations from that one source. Likewise, there is only one God for sure in Judaism. So how do we understand if there's God the Father, there's Jesus who's somehow divine, the Son of God, and there's the Spirit? How do we understand this all? So they needed these philosophical tools that had been developed by Plato and Aristotle and their heirs. So for example, they took this term, hypostasis, which is to say the underlying reality. That word I've talked about, substance, right? So when we had the formulation, the hypostasis is the Greek, substance here is the Latin. So this is in the Latin when we get words like I say, like transubstantiation, consubstantial. This is hypostasis, hypostatic union. So these needs of being able to say and formulate complicated theological and philosophical ideas were at the ready, since Plato's heirs had continued to develop ideas about Plato's concept of the one, the source of the form of forms, the good, and so forth. So while Tertullian claimed to hate Plato, he actually borrowed the idea of hypostasis that had been previously employed by Philo to explain the relationship in the persons of the Trinity. So in other words, they have one substance, one hypostasis together. They're in hypostatic union. All right, a contemporary of Tertullian, Origen of Alexandria, was a much more sophisticated thinker, and he was extremely influential and an amazingly prolific early Christian writer. So he was at the end of the second, early third centuries. Third century is when he's actually active as a writer. He studied both under Clement of Alexandria, an important father of the Christian church, but also under the Neoplatonist philosopher Ammonius Saccas. Origen had absolutely no qualms about using philosophical tools in formulating Christian theology. So Origen's influence was enormous. Like the Platonists, Origen was an idealist, and so who felt that matter was relatively insignificant. The material world was more important as the ideas, the spiritual world. Origen taught that the Logos, Christ, is the rational, creative principle that permeates the created universe. Origen's theology of God the Father paralleled Platonic ideas of the one. So in other words, a perfect unity, indivisible, invisible, incorporeal, and transcending all things material. In other words, quite similar. So Christian theology moves on from people like Origen. Platonism continued too in the pagan sphere too. And so Plotinus is in the 3rd century kind of one of the last great non-Christian philosophers. So Christianity is going to take over the empire soon, and there isn't going to be a place for great thinkers who aren't actually part of the empire's official religion. Plotinus is is not convinced and he doesn't like Christianity. Nevertheless, he is a Neoplatonist who is amazingly influential on Christianity. So he also studied under Ammonius Saccas, same teacher as Origen. He theorized that there was one source which was prior to all else, was undivided, and was equated with the concept of good, very much similar to what we're talking about before with Plato, but it's much more developed now with Plotinus, that everything else emanates from the one, that the first emanation is the intellect, which he calls the logos, or identifies with the logos, which is the will toward good. And then the next emanation is the world soul, which includes nature, from which proceeds things such as human souls and matter and so forth. So this is a very brief thumbnail. Plotinus is a very in-depth thinker we're going to have a whole lecture on in the future. But in any event, also quite, you can see this isn't that different, frankly, from contemporary, what his fellow student Origen is also saying within Christianity. So pagans and Christians are fairly close to each other at this point in history in terms of their underlying understanding, philosophy, theology of the universe. So Augustine of Hippo is where it all kind of comes together. St. Augustine is the great thinker of the Latin West, through whom essentially all of previous theology and philosophy and so on comes through him, and then it all goes out and is built on him afterwards. So he himself is initially a rhetoric teacher who became a Manichaean. We've had a lecture on the Manichaeans. They're an interesting world religion that subsequently died out, a dualist world religion. His mother was Christian, but he rejected it because he found when he read the Bible, he thought it's pretty dumb. It's really poor literature. He couldn't believe any of that because if you're reading it literally, it doesn't make many sense as far as he's concerned. He converted to Christianity only after he met Ambrose of Milan, another very important contemporary Christian thinker who taught Augustine that Scripture needed to be interpreted symbolically instead of literally. And after Ambrose shared the writings of Plotinus and other Neoplatonists to explain Christian theology. So then Augustine became a great thinker and writer whose philosophy and theology, like I say, set the course for the Latin tradition until the Western European recovery of Aristotle in the Middle Ages. So Augustine's theology influenced everybody else. He's directly influenced by Origen and the Neoplatonists, like Plotinus. Everybody else who came after him is influenced by Augustine because, on the one hand, he's a great thinker. On the other hand, he wrote so much. So, for example, when the Christian writer Boethius turned to philosophy for his Consolation in the 6th century, it was to Christian Neoplatonism. And so, to kind of just bring this forward, I have a little bit of a timeline here. Plato all the way back in the 400s to 300s BC, Jesus around the early part of the 1st century of the Common Era, Augustine and Boethius together at the end of the Roman Empire in the West. And then as we kind of emerge out of the darker part of the Middle Ages into the height of the Middle Ages and then the early modern time period to get to us. So Anselm, Aquinas, Descartes, Kant, and us. So Boethius here writing after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but still within a very late antique world. It's kind of the very beginning of the Middle Ages, the very end of antiquity. He wrote a book that we've had a lecture on called The Consolation of Philosophy. And it's one of the most copied, read, translated, and studied books throughout the Middle Ages. So for example, King Alfred the Great actually translated it into Old English, and Queen Elizabeth I translated it into Elizabethan English. So in other words, it was an important book that scholar kings felt and queens felt them compelled to themselves do the translation work, or their court helped them, I'm sure, because that's important for their philosophy. It's also the source of Chaucer's philosophy, imagery from the Roman de la Rose, Boccaccio's Decameron, Dante's Divine Comedy. Divine Comedy has been called an expansion of Boethius. So who was he? He was one of the last great thinkers who had access to all of classical antiquity. And he had as a project to translate all of Plato and Aristotle into Latin. And if he had actually completed his project, that would have completely altered Western history. Part of the problem for Western thinkers, with the contraction of learning and the ability to get books and so on, also the ability to read Greek was lost for most Western scholars. And so pretty much if it was translated into Latin, you could have it. And so essentially the fact that Boethius translated Aristotle's prior analytics topics and sophistical refutations, those were among the very few bits of Aristotle available to the early medieval West, and it pretty much formed the basics for logical thought through most of the Middle Ages, because they had those components that Boethius had done. So through his commentaries, he also intended to synthesize Plato and Aristotle, which became kind of the project for Christians for the rest of the Middle Ages as well, especially when some of the texts were really recovered in the Central Middle Ages. So Boethius had been the prime minister of the barbarian king Theodoric the Ostrogoth. He was essentially arrested for a conspiracy. His sympathies may have been with Constantinople, which continued to be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Gothic party, led by a minister named Cyprian, denounced a member of Boethius's party named Albinus as a traitor, and they said he was plotting and so forth. Boethius himself got charged with treason and was deprived of his office and imprisoned. He wrote in this book, the Consolation of Philosophy, about fickle fortune, and really popularized this idea of the wheel of fortune. And you can see as fortune just mercilessly turns her wheel, the little guy who's being raised up, the king's on top, and then you can see the person being cast down. In other words, there's all kinds of things that are not in our control. Fate and fortune, fortune is things happen that are without chance, happens without our control. So during his imprisonment, waiting execution, that's when Boethius writes this book. It's not a systematic philosophy, but it is a very accessible and compelling popular book meant to convey practical philosophy. And Boethius writes the text as a conversation between himself and Lady Philosophy, philosophy personified, the anthropomorphic expression of Western thought. So Lady Philosophy finds Boethius with the Muses. She identifies him as a patient in need of her remedies, and so that becomes the allegory of the book. After a whole bunch of different arguments, we have a whole lecture on this topic, which you should go to. She says, none of these things I've tried are very strong medicine, but I have something deeper medicine. So she argues, if I ask you whether there is anything more precious to you than your own self, you will say no. So if you are in possession of yourself, you will possess something you would never wish to lose, and fortune can't take away. So in other words, if you yourself are well grounded, if you have been a good person, if you're a philosopher, it doesn't matter, as the Stoics would even say, if you're in a prisoner, that's not something that fortune can take away the way riches are. So philosophy, as she's arguing with Boethius, she says that although people think that money, reputation, power, etc., are actually the ends that they're seeking, that in every one of those cases, they're actually seeking something else. So she argues if a person is seeking wealth, philosophy argues that people what actually want is to be self-sufficient. But she says wealth actually brings nothing of the kind, since rich people continue to be very dependent on others. Thus, none of these wants are naturally or intrinsically good, nor do they lead to true happiness. And so philosophy shows that the way is actually to the highest good, good for goodness' sake, love for love's own sake, and so on. So following Plato's Timaeus, one of the very few Platonic dialogues that actually got translated into Latin and so was available to people in the Middle Ages, philosophy argues that, quote, if there were a being self-sufficient, able to accomplish everything from its own resources, glorious and worthy of reverence, surely it would also be supremely happy, which leads ultimately to the conclusion that God and happiness are one and the same thing, and that in seeking true happiness and goodness and unity, a person is seeking the same thing, God. Having made the Platonic case for God as the supreme good, philosophy then also offers Boethius Platonic answers to the problem of evil. She says, evil is its own punishment, because participating in evil brings only false happiness. While good people seem to suffer, this is only material suffering, but in seeking the supreme good, good people alone participate in true happiness. So whether you're convinced by her arguments or not, one of the points that I think I'm trying to make here is that Christian theologians, the leading thinkers throughout all of these times, are very much grounded in these same kinds of arguments that are ultimately drawn from Plato. So, we mentioned here, we've gone through a little bit about Augustine and Boethius at the very beginning of the Middle Ages. We've also had lectures on Anselm and Aquinas at kind of as we get to the Central Middle Ages. We talked about Anselm of Bec, who is Archbishop of Canterbury. He's a major political figure of his time and therefore not just some thinker living off in an ivory tower. Nevertheless, he's also a prolific author, influential teacher, and he also innovates in the use of logic and has a really enduring impact on the emerging university system, scholasticism, that's being created at the time period that he is existing in the Central Middle Ages. So his philosophy ultimately influences Aquinas and Descartes, and his definition of theology, faith-seeking understanding, continues to be quoted. He's most famous for his ontological argument, and we have that whole lecture on the ontological argument. But before he composed that, he had another book, another argument called the Monologion, the Monologue, or the Monologue on Reason for Faith, in which he cites and follows Augustine's work on the Trinity. Everyone after Augustine follows Augustine. And he proposes arguments for God's existence through Platonic ideas about goodness, hierarchy, and necessity. So I just want to give you a little taste of that. So he writes in the Monologion, of all things that exist, there is one nature that is supreme. It alone is self-sufficient in its eternal happiness, yet through its all-powerful goodness it creates and gives to all other things their very existence and their goodness. Now take someone who has either never heard of nor does not believe in, and so does not know this. I think that they can, even if of average ability, convince themselves to a large extent of the truth of these beliefs simply by reason alone. Now, since this could be done in several ways, I will set down one that I consider to be the most readily available. Anyone, then, can quite easily ask himself the following question. Given that there is such an uncountable number of good things, the sheer multiplicity of which is simply a datum of bodily sense as well as something we perceive by means of the rational mind, given this, are we to believe that there is some one thing through which all good things whatsoever are good? Or do different good things have their existence through different things? So anyway, we're not going to get into like all of this argument or whether any of this kind of Platonist and Neoplatonist arguing convinces you to believe in God or any of these things. Just rather, what I want to kind of say is how all of this framework is pulling from these same Platonic terminology and worldview and conceptions, right? So he's talking about we're having sense data that are a bodily sense from the sensible world, the material world, as Plato is talking about it in his dualism, versus something that we perceive via the rational mind, the intelligible world, the world of the forms, of the ideas of realism, and so forth. So that's already right there. And in the same way, he's talking about the different good things and whether good things share in the form of goodness itself. So in other words, is every good thing just its own, how are they related to each other? How are they things that we call connected with a principle of goodness and so forth? So here's a goodness argument in the Monologium. So many things are good, including thing X, Y, and Z. And so even though X may be better than Y and Y may be better than Z, they're all good, but they simply have different degrees of goodness. If they're all good, they have something in common that causes them to be good. All things that are good depends on that which causes goodness, and according to Anselm's argument here. So, in other words, that which causes goodness is very good, and further is good through itself. As such, it is goodness in the highest degree, in other words, the supreme good. And so, anyway, this is how, he is making this kind of Platonic argument for good things participating in the good, and of which the supreme good is the cause of good, right? He also has an hierarchy argument. If one considers the nature of things, one cannot help realizing that they're not all of equal value, but differ in degrees. For the nature of a horse is better than that of a tree, and that of a human more excellent than that of a horse. And to doubt that is simply not human. It is undeniable that some natures can be better than others. So slugs are not as good, according to Anselm here. Nonetheless, reason argues that there is some nature that so overtops the others that it is inferior to none. So we can't have infinite regress. There's got to be some hierarchy that's here at the top. For if there is an infinite distinction in degrees, so that there is no degree which does not have a superior degree above it, then reason is led to conclude that the number of natures is endless. But this is senseless. We can't have infinite regress. There has to be, there's got to be something that's the top, right? Necessarily then, there is some nature which is superior to others in a way that it is inferior to none. So that's just a taste of this kind of logical argument that Anselm is making, which you can kind of see, I think, is very much in keeping with, it's based a lot more on Plato than it's based, let's say, on reading the Hebrew Bible. So Anselm ultimately has a definition that than which none greater can be conceived for how he understands God. And from that, then, he derives a host of divine qualities, including whatever it is better to be than not to be. And so ultimately, Anselm's reasoning tells him that God is justice, truth, omnipotence, mercifulness, impassibility, which is to say inability to suffer, immateriality, self-existence, wisdom, goodness, happiness, permanence, unity, since all of these are better than their opposites. All right, so that's all the way through to Anselm. We are going to have a lecture next week on Aquinas, so I'm not going to go into detail on Aquinas today. Instead, I want to just conclude by kind of talking about one of the things, we talk about how these ideas have been pulled all the way through, that, frankly, up into just within the last couple, even to the present, when we're talking about all of Western thought being footnotes to Plato, that certainly through late antiquity and the Middle Ages, medieval theologians and philosophers are all focusing on what Plato and Aristotle said and how they understand that to those kind of thoughts that they're creating in a philosophical worldview to understand and formulate their own understanding in light of Christianity, how they are experiencing it. And in so doing, their experience, the population, a different percentage of the population is experiencing it. So in Plato's day, the number of people who were involved, who listened to Socrates, who were part of Plato's direct school or Aristotle's school or anything like that, it's just a tiny proportion of the elite population that embraced philosophical thinking. There's still huge effects that happen because some of those people include Plato's teaching, the dictator of Syracuse and Aristotle's teaching Alexander. So, it's not like having these ideas doesn't have massive effects, but it's not like they're immediately getting infused into the whole giant population. Whereas by the time you get to late antiquity and medieval religion, these ideas get effectively the basis for a religion that definitely gets transmitted to the whole popular level. And so, in some sense, the triumph of Christianity is, in a way, taking Greco-Roman philosophy and actually bringing it to the masses, even if the masses don't ever quite get it or experience it or so on. But in part, that's part of what happened. And so that is my brief thumbnail of Plato and Christianity and how amazingly intertwined Plato's thought is with Christian theology throughout time and even down to the present. And so, like I say, we've had wonderful discussion questions, and hopefully you've already been writing some of your comments and questions and so forth into the chat. And Leandra's been maybe compiling those and is going to get them for me as I get a glass of water. And I'm not leaving you with new questions because there's just too much that went on today. So. Awake at the Wheel says, I recently heard it said that Nietzsche called Christianity Platonism for the masses. Well, I just said that at the... that was my conclusion. I'm sure the comment... No, but I think that's good. So, I mean, so Nietzsche and I agree on that. We don't agree on everything, but yeah, so... yes, I think that's a thumbnail, like any anytime you make a simplification, like when you say all of Western thought is a footnote to Plato, that's obviously overselling it. And the same thing. And so is Christianity merely Platonism for the masses? Okay, there's some truth there, and but it's an oversimplification. Yes, but I think there's a fundamental truth there. Yes. So the NA Works says, is there any chance Jesus explicitly knew about Diogenes? Or was Jesus more generally inheriting from the school of Cynicism, or do we just not know? So what I'd say on those kind of things is we just don't, those are things we can't know. Is there a chance that Jesus would have explicitly have heard about Diogenes? He's living, like I say, right next to Sepphoris, a very sophisticated Hellenistic Greek-speaking city that's lots of the people in Nazareth were probably the workers who helped build it and everything like that. So there's every possibility of those kind of things, but we don't have any. So without having actually like direct evidence. So when there is so when we have, let's say, literary dependency, when we have something like that where we can just show a direct connection, then we can show it. Otherwise, we can simply say, Cynicism is one of these schools of thought that was widely spread around the Hellenistic world. Nazareth, Judea of the first century had already been part of the Hellenistic world for 3 centuries, and there was Greek influence that goes back even before that. These ideas are around. So, I don't think that any of the scholars like Crossan or something like that is actually saying that Jesus went off to Cynic school or something like that. Rather, these are ideas that a contemporary group of Greek thinkers are having as kind of social reformers, people who are attacking mindless tradition and convention, and it could be something that is being done by Jesus and other leaders, John the Baptist and so forth, in the Jesus movement. Without even it being in direct imitation or anything like that, but just simply as a contemporary idea that is happening kind of at the same time. So yeah, we don't know, but it's possible. Stephanie Ceresi asked, does Jesus teaching against Sirach actually having anything to do with leaving that book out of the Protestant Bible? Was it also known as Ecclesiasticus? So yeah, I think that Sirach is also known as Ecclesiasticus. It does not have anything to do with leaving it out of the Protestant Bible, I don't think. So in fact, actually, I don't think that very many people have identified Jesus teaching against Ecclesiasticus against Sirach. So I think this is an interesting case that Randall Helms is actually making. So he's making a case here for textual dependency. So in other words, he's saying that enough of the Q gospel, enough of the sayings gospel is actually referencing teachings in Ecclesiasticus and actually counter-teaching them, that the author of Q is familiar with, whether it's Jesus or actually going back to Jesus, is actually familiar with that text and is actually directly countering it, which is interesting. So if that's the case, if you can establish, like I say, a literary dependence, then you can say, well, then that's something that Jesus or this early Christian readers who are the authors of Q would have had access to and are responding to, and they're in dialogue with that earlier text, Ecclesiasticus. Regarding leaving it out of the Protestant Bible, so Ecclesiasticus gets left out just like a whole bunch of other books. These are books that had been part of the Christian canon and continue to be part of the Christian canon in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches and so forth. But the Protestants threw them all out, and they called them the Apocrypha. They're called the deuterocanonical books in Catholics and Orthodoxy. And where that comes from is not the content. What comes from is that the Christian canon has always gone back to the Septuagint. So it always goes back to that Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. But when Protestants started opening up the hood on it and trying to change things and fix things, one of the things they did was they realized, well, wait a second, why are we translating? We want to have things in our Bible in our own language. If we're going to have a Bible in English, why would we translate something that is from Latin, that had been translated from Greek, that had been translated from Hebrew? We got to go back to Hebrew and get the Hebrew and translate the Hebrew and translate that into English. And there are Jewish people. So Jewish people exist in Western Europe. And so in other words, there are Hebrew Bibles available. And one of the things that the Protestants kind of realize when they do this is like, wait a second, Hebrew Bible doesn't have all these extra books. So the Hebrew Bible canon was actually created later. So Rabbinic Judaism gets formulated and is actually a newer religion than the earliest Christianity, which is formulated earlier. And the Christian canon is created earlier, and later when what's decided to be the Hebrew canon and Rabbinic Judaism, they don't like all these Hellenism that has maybe led to Christianity, and so instead they have a smaller canon. And so what the Protestants do is say, well, if it's not in the Jewish Bible, we're not going to have it be a part of. That must have been added, by pagans and so forth. And so they get rid of all those. That's why those were left out. Okay, the Godward podcasts ask, Heraclitus talked about logos before Philo. Now we're getting to the place when I'm doing these. I don't have the slide in front of me, so I'm going to have to go back and look at what it is. So I don't.
That's from very early.
Yeah, this was earlier in the lecture. I appreciate it with something at the time. I would have to go back to it, so I don't see it. So Mike is here. Actually, he said it's okay for me to call him Michelangelo. Mike Sanchez asks, did medieval thinkers think that Platonic forms existed in heaven in some way? Did Pythagorean thinking influence these philosophy discussions? So the answer is yes. So heaven is understood to not be the sky and the clouds. So some people incorrectly think that medieval people thought the world was flat, that Columbus was proving that the world was round. Medieval people all knew that the world was round, and they all understood that heaven is not the sky, in other words, in the clouds and so on, that it is an immaterial world. And so that immaterial world is the world of the Platonic forms. And so the Platonic forms actually, what they existed is not in heaven, they exist in the mind of God. So that's where kind of the innovation that Christians have for Platonism is that they now have a place where the forms can reside. And so the forms continue to be very influential, and heaven is this immaterial Platonic place. So the question on Pythagoras, did Pythagorean thinking influence these philosophical discussions? So it's having less influence at the later end. So lots of Pythagoreanism stuff is mostly lost. But it was really influential on Plato. So Plato had lots of, did some studying at a Pythagorean school, and Aristotle said Plato was really influenced by the Pythagoreans and so forth. And so much of the Pythagorean thinking gets transmitted into this whole thing, but through Plato, so right at the beginning. Brando said, did Aquinas cite Plato or Aristotle more? That's an interesting question. I don't have a list of that. He probably cites Augustine the most. That's what everybody does. But Aquinas is probably citing Aristotle more. But it doesn't mean that he's more, that every single thing, even for him, about their understanding of Aristotle is still viewed through a Platonic lens, because Plato had been the whole mainstream, and he's citing Augustine, who's essentially giving a Platonism. So what Aquinas is trying to do is bring Aristotle's ideas, which are viewed by a lot of his contemporaries as being very, very dangerous, and say, no, these are actually really in concord with what we already understand, the Platonic idea that has already been the center of everything that we've been doing ever since Augustine. Ron Wagner asked, did Plato's ideas influence Islam? Absolutely. So, in fact, when people like Anselm and Abelard and Aquinas are getting a hold of Plato and Aristotle, especially Aristotle, but Plato too, they are getting it through all of the rich Islamic philosophical thinkers who had been wrestling with the very same things just a few centuries earlier, at kind of the height of Muslim intellectualism, which had just had its flourishing and was now in kind of decline, right before kind of the explosion of thought in the Christian Middle Ages. And in fact, because in a lot of cases the Latins are getting their versions of Aristotle and so on, they're actually getting it, so like Greek translated into Arabic, translated into Latin, they're getting it through the commentaries of just very important Islamic thinkers. So the Latin names for whom, like Ibn Sina, or Avicenna and Averroes, as the Latin names for them. And so these Muslim philosophers and theologians who have to wrestle with very similar problems because of it's a related Abrahamic religion, they produce a lot of solutions that are adopted by the medieval Christian thinkers. So yes. So now we are to Daryl Scott, who writes, ancient philosophers understood the world via a priori logic. With physics, this now seems ridiculous and unscientific, so why do we listen to them when it comes to immaterial things? Well, so I would just say that in some cases, we definitely are in a place where materialism has been the kind of the lens through which things have been seen for the last several hundred years. And so in a lot of cases, even philosophy and so forth has become kind of radically materialistic, where everything is kind of understood in a physics kind of sense. And if you now think of physics as what science is, then then other kinds of thinking, logic, and so forth, might seem to you to be unscientific. Nevertheless, there are lots of things that, let's say, using the tools of studying physics are not always as great in understanding, let's say, the mind and how thoughts and ideas work, how some of these things about our humanity and so on, understanding self, these sorts of kind of questions that are still part of philosophy, the immaterial things that maybe seem immaterial or unimportant, but maybe are relevant to people for motivation, why you might want to do anything, why anything might have meaning to you, and so forth. This is still let's say, the open space for us to be contemplating these things. It doesn't mean that there's that the space, that everything in the material, physical science and everything like that isn't completely relevant and everything like that to everything we're doing, but there are other things, I think, that are still open philosophical questions, even if, like we kind of showed in that chart, it used to be all-encompassing and is now just a little tiny component of its former self. Maximilian Sonnethex said, how could non-Platonic Christianity be summarized quickly? Well, there's a kind of Christianity, it can't be summarized quickly because it would be there's multiple types of non-Platonic Christianity. I would say for the I kind of listed some leading theologians. I think certainly when we talk about Augustine and Aquinas, that's pretty much the top of the tier for Christian theologians, Origen and so forth. We've had all this list, but it's not like they're the only thinkers. There were plenty of others who would have argued against a lot of these things. So an example we've had a lecture on is William of Ockham, who argued kind of very strongly against the idea of ideas and forms, when his philosophy is called nominalism, because he's saying those are just names. There's no such thing as justice. Justice is just a word, and so on. So that would be the opposite of Platonic Christianity. And so it's not William of Ockham, very influential Franciscan thinker, and so on. And so that would be kind of a non-Platonic Christianity, although obviously one that is very much in dialogue with Platonism. So in other words, not Platonic Christianities, but informed by, but rejecting some of the central components of it. So that would be like a thinker example of a non-Platonic Christianity. And of course, you could also say that, like literalists and fundamentalists are obviously, very widespread and are also, they're really not informed by Platonic Christianity, but they wouldn't qualify probably as thinkers as much. So, all right. So a few users were also commenting on whether we can call Plato a fascist because of one of the things he advocates in the Republic are eugenics. So Plato. So Plato's really early, whether he can be called a fascist. I mean, so fascism is a modern development. If Plato's Republic, as it's kind of spelled out, if that were to exist now in the 21st century somewhere, it would be pretty fascist because it would be informed by our experience, which is fascist. So, I mean, in other words, where we know what fascism is and how a fascist society would work, this is a theoretical society that, we now have more practical experience and eugenics and understanding why that's a bad idea and all those kind of things. So when you're somebody who's back a couple thousand years ago and kind of theorizing about some of these things, he's got a bunch of very problematic ideas in addition to some interesting ideas. I mean, some of these ideas were still interesting, but we wouldn't want to advocate. I'm not in agreement with him, for example, when he's talking about censoring the religious texts. I was using that as an example of Plato as a person who is actually kind of a religious reformer, to show that he's interested in changing how people understand their traditional religion by getting rid of censoring texts. But again, so in that sense, burning books, that's also not something that I would advocate. So there's all kinds of things about Plato's Republic that would make me not want to live in it. Okay. Fastball Flakes said, John, where do I sign up to join your commune? I think you could build a pretty hip utopia. Think about it. Well, so we do have a community here, and people are part of this intentional community. We are not, though we're not actually living together in a commune. It is something that does happen a fair amount in the history of my particular denomination, my church. There's a friend of mine lives in, a couple friends actually live in a pretty cool, what was created as kind of like it's like a 1970s intentional Christian space commune where there's underground houses that are made out of concrete domes, so they don't have to be, so that for geothermal heating and so on, and it was shared around a common area with a co-op as the central store and so forth. So that's one that was kind of developed in the 70s, and it still looks kind of like the Dharma initiative. It's really cool. More recently, people have been working on things like doing co-housing, and certainly something that people think about and are, I know you're kind of making this as kind of a funny comment, but it is something that people think about in our movement in my church. So, all right. Thank you all so much. That was a really great and fantastic comments. We tried to do a lot in a short amount of time, and I grossly oversimplified everything throughout the whole thing, but the Nietzsche quote, Nietzsche was grossly oversimplifying, so was the quote about all of Western thought being a footnote to Plato. In order to, kind of show those kind of development, you have to do a little bit of simplification and that kind of thing. So next week we'll talk about Aquinas, and so I hope you'll join us. And so if I can advance, I guess we'll advance the slide. There we go.